Okay, let's get started. I might be time pressured with the number of slides I've got here. This talk today is about how feature and support requests work in open source projects, and we're going to use Kubernetes as an example of an open source project. I'll let you read the disclaimer or not. This is me. I'm an open source engineer working for VMware. I'm based in Los Angeles. I've been working on the Kubernetes project since 2015. My work has been in the fields of storage, IoT and edge, and running Kubernetes on top of the vSphere infrastructure, including the vSphere hypervisor. The dream in open source is that you submit issues to an army of idle developers who are waiting for your request, just like conjuring up a genie from a bottle. But the reality is a little different. It turns out that good outcomes demand persuading developers who don't work for you or who don't work for a vendor who you're giving money to invest their time and effort on your behalf to resolve your issue or to work on implementing your feature. This session is going to use Kubernetes as an example to explain how this really works behind the curtain, and I'm going to tell you 4 specific rules that are going to be essential to getting good outcomes. So, on the surface, it looks like this is easy. In open source, these projects are more typically hosted on GitHub. There are a few other source code repositories that are occasionally used, but using GitHub as an example here, you see here that there is a tab for issues, and issues, by the way, mean feature requests and bug reports. They do not mean support requests. We'll get into that later. But the first step would be to just click on that tab. After you click on this tab, you get a couple of these green buttons. The choices are bug report and enhancement request. For the sake of discussion, we're going to imagine that you are going down the path of looking for an enhancement request. A bot pre-populates this form. I hope you can see it in the back row. Even if you can't, it's giving you a template. This isn't just total free-form text. And you just fill that out. So is it really this easy? Push a button, enter a few lines of text, and some developer, you don't even have to pay, just jumps right on your problem. Is it really this easy? Well, if it is, this session would be over, but it's going to last another 25 minutes. It turns out that just as a few prerequisites, you do need to first get a GitHub account. If you're unfamiliar with that, it's pretty easy, but you do have to give some form of identity, like an email that gets responded to. You'd be wise to tighten up the credentials on this because they're potentially capable of being abused. And just an FYI, if your if this is a bug report regarding security, it turns out that the way these go down is a little different for security because everything you put here becomes public. Something to keep in mind, because if you're working on a commercial deployment of open source, maybe some characteristics of these bug reports are going to require you to divulge information that is delicate, and but there's no way around it. You're supposed to use the alternate form only for security-related bug reports. So there are some best practices here, and let's look at how the Kubernetes project is really working as a foundation for me explaining why these best practices really are best practices. First, a bit of history on Kubernetes. It's Greek for helmsman or pilot. It was started by Google, modeled after their internal Borg system that they use for their own IT operations. They aspired, and they were successful at this, at getting a containerized system for running workloads in public clouds. Their initial goal was to just put it on their own public cloud, but they did open source it, and it's now used by all the major public clouds as well as on-prem scenarios like running it on top of vSphere. It was released, version 1.0 was released in 2015. It's managed by the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, a nonprofit. But 2015, at the speed a lot of enterprises moves, is pretty young, or so you would think. But it's experienced phenomenal growth since that 1.0 release. You know, we're already up to a scenario where we've moved from tens of contributors to thousands, and this growth is maybe tapered down a bit in the last quarter, but it's still pretty phenomenal. So you've got a scenario where you've got thousands of developers. Even some of the biggest software commercial vendors may not have workforces that large. This is a pretty big project. Now, what drove that phenomena? Well, there's a whole bunch of things that, you know, really it's based on usage. An open source project is never going to grow if nobody even cares to use it. But Kubernetes has a bunch of these peripheral gears of users, devs, collateral tools, and vendors all driving this phenomenal growth. And you can see here metrics of users. We're now up to 700 plus meetup groups that are in various locations around the world, 300,000 members in those meetup groups. I won't read all these stats to you, but you can read them faster than I'd read them to you. But bottom line is there's a phenomenal amount of force, both from the vendor side and the user side, making this get bigger and bigger quarter after quarter. Let's drill down just into the tools scenario, which is one of the compelling reasons why Kubernetes is growing. The Cloud Native Compute Foundation shows this thing called the Cloud Native Landscape. I doubt that anybody in the back row can read this, and frankly, with my eyesight standing right here on stage, I can hardly read it, but these are all tools, most of them open source, that work with Kubernetes to make it better. Things like monitoring, logging, analytics, and many of these things are specifically tailored for Kubernetes. Specifically, some of them work with other platforms as well, but work very well with Kubernetes. There are categories here of clouds that host Kubernetes, vendors that support it and offer services. But the bottom line is that this eye chart shows you that this Kubernetes has just developed phenomenal momentum. And it's by this metric that the Cloud Native Compute Foundation calls velocity. It's the number 3 open source project, even though it only hit release 1 in 2015. Number 1 would be Linux, and number 2 would be Chromium, which powers Android phones and the Chrome browser and Chromebooks. So I think I gave you the message that Kubernetes is huge. Maybe you're going, so what? You know, I just put my issue in that GitHub page and it's like pulling a ticket and taking a number. Maybe the line is really long, like the line at the Department of Motor Vehicles where I work in the United States, but eventually they'll get to me. It doesn't quite work like that. You're going to put your issue into this huge project and aspire to get the attention of one of or several of these thousands of developers. This picture here is something that's in Seattle, Washington in the United States in an open air market they call Pikes Place. Somehow in the tradition of this open air market, they have a back alley where people for years have been taking wads of chewing gum and putting it on a wall. And that wall now has built up to wads of gum that are about 6 feet thick. And if you look at this, you'll see a few people have stuck business cards, Post-it notes, things like that. Well, the Kubernetes project is so big with so many developers that in a way, you can compare logging your issue to going and taking a piece of chewing gum and putting it on that wall buried with thousands of other globs that go there every week. And how likely is it that it's really going to get any attention? You know, with thousands of developers and millions of lines of code, I will guarantee you that there is no developer on the project that is waiting for that phone to ring and looking at every issue that comes along. So it is, if you want to cut the line like the nightclub and bribe the doorkeeper to get in, I'm going to give you some tips of what's involved with getting somebody's actual attention to your feature request or bug report and getting that resolved. And the first key relates to understanding how the project is organized itself. There is something called Conways Law that people first talked about with commercially vendored software, and that the Conways Law statement says that organizations which design systems or software produce designs which are copies of the internal structure of that organization. Studies by MIT, the Harvard Business School, Microsoft, and others have confirmed that this is really detectable in commercial software. Eric Raymond once observed that if you have 4 groups working on a compiler, you're going to end up with the 4-pass compiler. And I can tell you that this situation really applies to Kubernetes. So what is the org chart of Kubernetes? Well, they have broken this huge project along architectural lines into something called SIGs, or special interest groups. So this is a phenomenon where you have the equivalent of departments within a commercial software vendor. And you can take pictures of this, but I'm going to warn you that as Kubernetes grows, they have reorgs every quarter. And even I got this off of Twitter, where the guy is Brian Grant, who's one of the leads on the Kubernetes project, is saying, we just published this and it's already out of date. So they do attempt to publish some picture of what the org chart looks like, but the fact is, at any given time, there are people with PRs submitted saying, I propose that we change the org chart. So really, what you've got to do is make an effort to figure out where your bug fits in this scenario of Kubernetes. How can you do that? Well, if you're experiencing a bug and a particular error message comes out, you should search the GitHub repository for that specific message if you can hope you can find it. I mean, if it's parameterized, maybe you don't find an exact match, but I think anybody who's a developer is familiar with doing searches based on regular expressions or whatever, and you try to track it down and narrow it down to 1 or 2 parts of the code base where this is likely to have come about. Then you work your way up through that code base to see which SIGs are responsible for that niche of the code tree. And there is a mechanism in those bug reports and feature requests to actually tag it with the name of a SIG. The way GitHub works, you also have the option of tagging it with a specific individual's name. So if you can get likely parts of the source tree for where this was emitted, you can look at the history of who's been working on this recently, and it gives you a clue that, this handful of individuals is likely very interested and motivated in working on this. Maybe even if this isn't a long-standing defect, they may have even caused this situation. So just a clue that one of the steps is to actually learn the Kubernetes org chart, which is this formation of SIGs, and use this to target specific parts of where in the project you're going to submit your issue, and any options there are a lot of options for tagging it, and you should utilize them, because there are people who will subscribe to bug reports that have specific tags on it, but nobody subscribes to all of them. They're using a filter. So rule number 1 out of 4, classify your bug report or feature request. Find the right repo. So I told you, I oversimplified in that slide showing a Kubernetes repo, but it turns out that over time they have multiple repositories. So the main repo is the bulk of Kubernetes, but certain things like storage-related drivers and things like that can be found in secondary repos. Documentation is in its own. Something they call community is in another one. So depending on where it is, you start by looking for the repo. then maybe search for source code related to what you're interested in, find the SIG responsible. There is a link here for the master link of potential labels, but I recommend that you err on the side of too much labeling rather than not enough. And I'm not going to coach you on what they all are. Even the list of labels changes from month to month. So follow the link. Consider CCing, this is putting somebody's GitHub handle on this bug. If you can identify the SIG leads, the people running that niche, you may be able to narrow this down to concerned developers who have a history of working in this area. That would sum up my step number 1 of classify your bug or feature request. So rule 2, write a really detailed problem statement. Good problem statements are really appreciated and recommended in the community, because sometimes the fix will only be 1 or 2 lines of code, but isolating what's involved with recreating and what really went down when that happened, that could be a lot of effort. So as a minimum, you should state what you saw happen and what you expected to happen instead of what you saw happen. And you should indicate where and what you were running at the time it happened, what specific steps were required to make it happen. And I'd encourage you to provide very specific things like the specific error messages and relevant parts of logs. This isn't like dealing with commercial software where you can call a vendor, be outright rude, maybe potentially a little bit unhelpful because you're paying these people to fix your problem. In an open source scenario, people can often be upset by an inadequate bug description, and they will, you can manage to pigeonhole your name with, oh, I looked at the last thing this person submitted and it was a waste of my time. And they're just going to put you on this list of spammers or people not responsive. So invest the effort, more so than you might typically do with commercial software, of documenting the actual nature of the problem and gathering up logs for this person who you should view as really a volunteer. Rule 3 is make sure you follow up to questions and comments. So actually putting your detailed problem statement out there is a lot like fishing, where you put the bait on the hook, but as soon as you get that first nibble, you want to set that hook, and the key to setting that hook is to being really responsive. Don't sit there. When that person responds to your feature request or bug report, it's kind of a clue that the person is saying, okay, I'm interested and I have some time at this moment. But if you sit there and wait for like a week or two, the situation might change. The person might get distracted by some other issue submittal where they were more responsive than you, and suddenly they're busy and they've forgotten all about yours. So be responsive in a sense of time. Now, I will warn you that you can't expect these things to be like commercial hotlines where you get guaranteed responses in a matter of hours. Many of the people working on Kubernetes are in time zones different from yours. I think the largest share of the contributors are in the United States, with maybe number 2 being China, and a pretty vast differential in time zones, as well as even what days of work they take off during the week. And if your issue goes in there at the wrong time, it might appear that you're getting nothing for days, but just give it some time, because there's no telling where the person that deals with this is going to be located. When the exchange goes interactive, you should aspire to being very quickly reactive, though, to any requests for additional information. Rule 4, there's a lot of community etiquette here, written and unwritten. If you look at the community part of the GitHub repository, they will give you written standards, but just to be polite, before you submit issues, you should search and make sure that somebody else didn't actually find something identical or very similar to the issue you found. So being lazy and not, frankly, searching might even find you workarounds, because people, when they're going to do a code fix, will also put in the issue temporary workarounds saying, look, if you do these 5 steps, it probably isn't going to happen. So it might be worth your time, but always search for duplicates before you throw your issue into the fire. These issues are not for support requests, so if it's clearly a bug, fine. But if you're just confused and you don't know how this is done, you don't open up a GitHub issue for that kind of thing. I have some slides that explain the proper way to do this, but you will actually irritate people if you use opening issues as a mechanism to simply get support requests in, particularly when they're support requests of the nature of not even reading the documentation. Be very careful about the language when you support this. With a commercial vendor, you can be rude and get away with this, but just doing something like, I tried to do this and the documents suck, that is very likely to get you a non-positive response. You'll get ignored if you're lucky. You might get blacklisted if you're going into an indefinite point in the future if you're unlucky about this. Similarly, thanks and praise is very well received. When somebody helps you out, giving them recognition and thanking them both in the issue, and there are avenues in Kubernetes to even do it publicly in something they have called a community meeting. That'll go a long way if you're going to have a long-standing relationship with using Kubernetes in your organization. Getting yourself recognized by this pool of developers as being appreciative is useful, and they actually talk amongst each other. And some of if you're in a big organization or company, that reputation effect maybe doesn't just apply to you, but anybody with the same tail end on the emails. So you can have a few rude individuals that maybe will result in blacklisting your whole organization in the eyes of that Kubernetes community. So be careful. Read the code of conduct. Another thing you can do is pitch in and help. Kubernetes has these, I'll get into this for resources on how to learn this, but they have annual conferences, their version of VMworld, they're called KubeCons. And you can actually get FaceTime with the developers at these, and if you do this, I think it goes a long way, where I know as a developer myself, when I see somebody submit an issue and go and say to myself, oh, I remember that person, I met them 6 months ago. You don't tend to ignore those. So getting active in the community, even if you're not a developer, they're always in search of people to help write the documentation, to give presentations and how-tos, make a video or a blog. And this is all heavily recognized in that community. So pitch in and help. Even if your skills aren't as a coder, they are looking for things like this. And as I stated, just writing very good bug reports is actually a contribution. And your name goes in there, and the project actually tabulates those things. So GitHub makes it very easy for someone to look up your name and give the history of how many activities you're engaged with on an annual basis inside GitHub. And people can and do look at that kind of stuff. So you will be viewed as a contributor in Kubernetes if you do a good job on these things that aren't really checking in code. So my recap of this is what goes on behind the curtains, and I apologize that maybe you can't read this, but I'll orally state it. You create the issue in GitHub. There's a phase of ongoing questions and comments. So typically, you'll create the issue, but developers who aspire to help you out on this are likely to ask you a few questions. Somebody gets inspired to do the work. It may or may not require re-architecture. If it requires architecture, that's a pretty detailed thing that you're not going to have happen probably for a full release cycle of Kubernetes, because architectural changes are going to require reviews by more people than just one developer. If it isn't architectural, a developer is going to write some code, submit something called a pull request. It's an artifact. This is just how Git source code repositories work. Reviewers will authorize that change. The reviewers are typically going to be the SIG chairs or the SIG leads. So one person isn't allowed to just do a unilateral forced check-in into Kubernetes. There's going to be at least a couple of eyeballs looking at that before it goes in, and it means it takes as a minimum a couple of days. When it's approved for release, it gets checked in. Now, the approval just puts it in the tip of the master branch. So that isn't automatically built at that time, and Kubernetes releases roughly quarterly. So after it gets approved, it should show up in the next Kubernetes quarterly release. But if you really needed it now, your option would be to check out the source code repository, build it yourself, and you're on a one-off Kubernetes release, potentially with gobs of additional bug fixes that are unrelated to yours, and it might be a pretty dangerous place to live because of that. There's a lot of system testing that doesn't take place until the quarterly release, but it is an option. So it sits there parked. If you're willing to live on the bleeding edge just to prove that that did really fix your bug, you can go check that out and take your chances on living on tip of master branch on something you built yourself, or you wait for that quarterly release. So that recap of how this goes down. How do you get support? I said earlier that if it's a support request, you really shouldn't open an issue. You should first read the documentation, and from this deck, these are all links. There's a troubleshooting guide. You can go to Stack Overflow or Server Fault. Caution here is some of the things there can get voted up but be very old, and the velocity that Kubernetes moves at means that a lot of this stuff can get stale. You really should have a sell-by date on anything related to Kubernetes of about 6 months from now. So anytime you see a blog or something on Stack Overflow, look at that date, and if it's more than 6 months old and it's of the nature of this is the best way to do this, be skeptical at least. If it's 2 years old, be super skeptical. Some SIGs and working groups do have active mailing lists, so you join this through Google Groups. I would go join the group, poke around through the existing mails to see if they're dealing with support requests there. Some of the areas of Kubernetes are willing to deal with them there, some are not. There is something called Slack. That is horrible to search, but it can be very responsive, meaning you can put a request for support there and get a response in 5 minutes, because there are thousands of people online, often even in the middle of the night. So recommended. Because of the poor search, Kubernetes is trying to move to these discussion forums. The official answer is in the future. They want people to be on discussion forums, so you might find things in their docs saying you should put your request on discussion forums. My honest answer is Slack is so much more active that it's a better place to go, although the search is poor. There's so much activity there, it rolls around every couple weeks. So somebody might have had your problem, and you'd be searching through so much stuff that you'd never find it. So where do you go for more? This is a link to something called Kube Academy. It's modeled after the Khan Academy, short 15-minute snippet educational videos, so learn about Kubernetes there. QR code will link you to that. It's cube.academy if you can't read that because of the poor contrast. Here's a few more. The local, if you're in a big city, I'm in Los Angeles, these meetup groups are great. It got so popular that we forked into 2 meetup groups in Los Angeles, one on the West Coast, one more central, and we sometimes have 250 people show up for monthly meetings there. And a lot of the tech centers of the world have very active meetup groups, and you can meet other users, and it's a good place to learn about it and talk amongst each others for problems. The conferences like the KubeCons, there are regular podcasts. VMware offers one called TGIK. There's training programs, certifications, blogs. So there you have it. I'm going to ask you that these talks on open source at a VMworld are fairly rare. So we'd like to get feedback to see if people really like these things. So I'm going to have an ask for you, even if you think that my talk wasn't interesting and was the worst thing you ever heard, please fill that out. Likewise, if you thought it was great, fill that out, but we legitimately want feedback. So if you're going to do one survey, please make it be this one, because we want to know if we should add more content like this or get rid of it altogether, and all you're interested in is the commercial software. So thank you for coming, and I'll close with that link to the Cube Academy. And then here's how you can reach me. So both my GitHub handle and my Twitter are Can't Be Wong, and I'm on the Kubernetes Slack as Steve-Wong. And I'll hang around outside if you want to talk about anything on Kubernetes, whether related to this subject or not. I'll be out there in the hall. So thanks for coming.